Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein. And before we continue our talk, I'd like to thank the Jewish Federation of Greater Des Moines and the Jewish Community Relations Commission of the Jewish Federation for their support of our show today. So, Mark, let's talk about the news of the day. I'm still trying to get my head around what the implications are of reconciliation. Well, I'm having trouble with a lot of the immediate responses that people are putting forward.
Not just the immediate responses. Several things to keep in mind. First of all, Abbas has not set foot in Gaza since 2007 to begin with. And the second thing, in essence, is that the reconciliation talks over the last 8 years, there have been four or so types of these reconciliation pacts signed. They've never come into fruition. So the first question is, what makes you think that this is going to be any different?
Yeah, and I do think there's a question of whether or not this is a real agreement or it's just going to die on the vine. I mean, is anything going to come of this? Is this a threat? We're going to go through with this if Israel doesn't come to the table, and then we're going to back off as soon as Israel. But I don't think that's what's going on.
Well,
because you don't have public appearances of Fatah and Hamas officials shaking hands and partying in the streets in Gaza.
Well, they've shaken hands before.
Yeah, but it seems like it's a little bit more. In fact, it seems like it's an intentional. It's an attempt to say we're done, we're moving on. And what I don't understand is why people don't understand that. I mean, the Palestinians have a lot of issues that they need to deal with.
Sure. And the basic fact is people who have looked at this situation seem to say that the original agreement now with between Hamas and Fatah is on the most superficial level to begin with. And to a certain degree, that creates a reality that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about the bigger picture here.
Okay.
I mean, there are people who argue that Israel can't have it both ways, that Israel can't have a situation that says we can't negotiate with Abbas because he doesn't represent the Palestinian people, and then at the same time say we can't negotiate with Abbas because he's unified with Hamas now. And the reality is, of course, they can.
But there's the other option. You can't expect to negotiate with, if Hamas itself will create its own Hamastan if left to its own devices, and that creates a three-state solution. So there have been critics who have said, don't negotiate with the Palestinians until they reconcile. That's one standpoint. And the other position is don't negotiate with the Palestinians if they do reconcile, because you don't know what the internal balance of that is going to be in the first place.
Well, and so the situation really becomes, for me, it's not a matter of it's bad that they're reconciling necessarily, but I do think that when you fundamentally change the nature of the group that you're negotiating with, and you do so in such a way that you have no idea what the implication is going to be for current agreements, much less for future agreements, you simply cannot proceed with negotiations until you have some of those answers.
That certainly is on the table to look at, because it's like I'm signing a deal for a car, but I'm signing the deal with a different agency that I originally negotiated for the car about. So you're right. You won't understand the deal until you understand the deal again.
I mean, there are a lot of questions. I wrote an article, I mean, just so you know, I wrote an article today for the We Are for Israel organization about the reconciliation and about concerns. And it starts off, there was an article written today by J.J. Goldberg for the forward, basically, that said exactly what I just just noted. He wants to, at least the concern that I just noted. He says Israel can't have it both ways, or at least functionally. This is what he said. I don't know that I have a direct quote, but paraphrase. It can't say that it should not negotiate with President Abbas because he doesn't have legitimacy since there haven't been elections and he doesn't govern Gaza, while also saying that Israel should not negotiate with a Palestinian Authority reconciled with Hamas. Now, I don't understand why those are even at odds with one another. I think it's a fallacious argument to say that because one does not necessarily lead to the other. Of course, they actually have to do that, I think. The very concept that the Palestinian leadership reconciliation with Hamas should have no impact on the ongoing cooperation, much less negotiations, is ridiculous.
So essentially, there are people who are saying, regardless of how this comes out, the negotiations should proceed as regular.
Yes, which doesn't make sense to me. I cannot see how you can one day say that we're negotiating with Fatah because they're not working with Hamas, and the next day say Israel must negotiate with them because they're working with Hamas.
Well, look at what is the ulterior motivation for people who take this view?
The real motivation for this is that there are people who want to see a peace agreement, and they believe that if the peace process stops for any reason, that it's all done. And they believe that if they deal with the reality in this situation, that negotiations are never going to happen again. They're of the belief that the best chance for negotiations to happen is to continue pressing forward. The issue here is whether or not the parties sit on the other side of a table from one another.
Yes.
There's simply no way that they can come to an agreement until many questions are hashed out on the ground. I mean, I'm not even talking about on paper. I'm talking about demonstrated on the ground over a period of time. So, for example, Gershon Baskin, who's very familiar with Hamas, we generally don't agree with Gershon Baskin on many issues.
But he's a nice guy.
I mean, he's a nice guy.
Yeah.
But he often takes the position that the Palestinians are right, and he's often very critical of the Israeli government, much more so than we generally are. And he has a lot of major concerns. And the questions that he's asking here of this agreement, I think are not only important, but they're essential to understand on Israel's behalf before it can even think of negotiating.
And your point is, if Baskin's raising this,
well, for sure, the Israelis have to.
Yeah.
But I mean, you have questions like whose ideology are they unifying under? You can't possibly have say we're going to negotiate under two different ideologies, one of which says that any negotiation is invalid and the possibility of negotiation is invalid. You can't have that be part of the philosophy. So Avi Issacharoff on Times of Israel this afternoon who wants to say, well, Hamas is agreeing to the Palestinian Authority ideology, but I'm not sure that that's true.
Or it's not. It may not be true under the surface.
It's certainly not demonstrably true.
Yeah.
I mean, even if it's on paper that they're working with them, we need to see it in action. Will Hamas's military wing be brought into the PA security forces or not? I mean, are we going to see Hamas's military wing be the Palestinian Authority security forces in Gaza?
Right.
We don't know.
So there are two choices. Either the Hamas supplants the Fatah military wing, or it combines with it, or...
Well, I mean, just think of how this works on the actual ground. I mean, you're going to say that people who have up to this point for the past multiple years been trying to capture Israeli soldiers and hold them for ransom, if not torture and kill them, are going to suddenly be cooperating with the Israelis like the West Bank Palestinian Authority
as the establishment.
As the establishment under past agreements?
Yeah.
I mean, I think anybody who would say that that's automatically going to be the case, you'd have to raise a serious eyebrow here. That seems like something that no one could make the case for.
Except for the people. There are people out there who say Hamas is not really a terrorist group.
Well, look, if you get to the point where you can, where it's proven on the ground. I mean, if I saw them actually cooperating,
yes,
then you could say, okay, well, maybe the Israelis can work with Hamas and security things moving forward.
On
but
a
right
pragmatic
now, how in the world
level,
could you possibly believe that? And we're not even getting, there are other serious questions. the PA security force is going to continue security coordination with Israel when they have to arrest Hamas members. Are you going to, is Hamas going to give up control of Gaza, of the Gaza side of the Erez crossing, much less give control of Gaza? I mean, are they simply going to support the Palestinian Authority in word, or are they going to support it in deed?
Well, and part of that is whether the PA itself will demand certain things of them, or will say, look, our agreement means you have authority on these particular topics, and we're not going to dispute that.
Well, I mean, I think I don't even think you're at that point yet. You're at a point where there are going to be elections. At least they say they're going to be elections. But what happens if the sides don't like who wins? I mean, what happens if Hamas doesn't like who wins the election? Are they going to say, no, we're not going to support this anymore? Are you going to, if Hamas wins the election, are the Palestinian Authority going to say, sure, in which case then you've got Hamas running the West Bank?
Yeah.
Are you going to have an issue of the financial support for the Palestinian Authority when the United States government is theoretically prohibited from giving funds to a terrorist organization? Hamas is a recognized terrorist organization, and now Fatah, who we've been pretending is not a terrorist organization, even though their origin is as a terrorist organization, for the past multiple years, is now officially working with a terrorist organization. Yeah. Doesn't that officially invalidate any possible aid we could be giving? I mean, they're
except for the pragmatists. The pragmatists are likely to say, regardless of what the reality of the situation is, as long as it doesn't break apart the whole pie, it's workable. Wouldn't you say that's the pragmatist?
What whole pie are we talking
about? The whole pie that's conceived of as the negotiations between the two sides, for which Israel basically bears 98% of the responsibility in the first place.
Well, I mean, look, I think you could make the argument that people are going to press Israel to stay at the negotiating table. They're going to press the Palestinians to stay at the negotiating table, and they're going to sit there and frown at each other, and nothing's going to happen because no one can possibly make any concessions until you know what the impact of this stuff on the ground is going to be. It's simply not possible to look at it on paper and say, here's what's going to happen, make concessions based on what we say on paper.
Except for the idealists who are already jumped to that conclusion.
No. I mean, look, the idealists are a different issue. What I'm saying is everything outside the negotiating table is going to be completely irrelevant. At the negotiating table, you simply do not negotiate based on what people think should happen as opposed to what is actually going on. You negotiate based on what's actually going on. And in this case, you have no idea what's going on. There's no possible way that
it's too ambiguous.
That Israel can continue to negotiate until it has concrete answers to these questions.
And those, as you're saying, those concrete answers take time to formulate.
Well, Israel's going to have to see implementation of this agreement on the ground before it knows what the implications of the agreement are. And not only that, so will Egypt and so will Jordan. It's not like they're irrelevant either. I mean, right now, Egypt is at war with Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood.
That's right.
I mean, fully at war.
Mm-hmm.
They were ready to invade Gaza not long ago. If Israel didn't basically say, no way in the world are we going to let you do that, you'd have Egyptian troops in Gaza killing large numbers of Hamas people.
But from a pragmatic standpoint, is the date we're dealing with still the April 29th technical ending of the negotiations, or has that point been swept aside?
Well, I think at this point it's going to be the Palestinians are going to have to agree to extend negotiations to continue to get funding.
Without any external...
I think
they keep making more prerequisites.
I think there's an issue of, first of all, whether or not Congress holds them accountable for this agreement, in which case this agreement probably singularly invalidates any or prevents the U.S. from giving them money.
Right,
It may well
right, the
by itself.
reconciliation agreement. Yes. But there will be people who will argue about
So
that.
what you may end up having is some sort of an agreement with the U.S. that says as long as the Palestinians continue to negotiate, they'll continue to receive funding. So you're going to have this ridiculous negotiation through the end of the year in which you have Palestinians who have no intention or ability of making any compromises sitting across from Israelis who can't possibly make any compromises either until they even know what's going on here. So you're going to have a totally artificial negotiation
But
that makes some people happy who want to see a negotiation.
Yeah, but domestically, we're going to see again a lobby that says don't cut off any funding from the PA under any
Well, and the
circumstances.
Israelis don't necessarily want it cut off either. That's the issue here, is that if you cut off the funding, especially if the EU and U.S. cut off funding, you could end up having the Palestinian Authority collapse, in which case then you got chaos.
But you then
even in this
you can't
situation-
have it both ways. You can't argue that the funding is an issue when essentially it's not an issue.
Well, I think the issue is that unless there's some sort of concession made, it is an issue, because right now it's automatic. So there'd have to be some sort of.
We've seen other automatics that have been turned into.
And I think that's
prerogatives.
what's going to happen. So I mean, there are people in the U.S. Congress who want to argue that this automatically invalidates the funding because
Right.
they've wanted to do that for a while.
Yes.
I wouldn't be surprised if there's an immediate halt to the funding and then have it restored later in some sort of discussion. Meanwhile, the situation the Israelis are in is basically untenable. The Israelis can't possibly work with this government. They can't possibly transfer funds to this government, certainly not into Gaza. And if they find out that money going to the West Bank ends up in Gaza, they're going to have to terminate that. So they've already halted a lot. They're going to have to halt more. And it has nothing to do with the peace process.
I think that's a fairly
This
broad.
has to do with actual active
Right.
operations at the moment.
But that's probably coming from a fairly large chunk of the majority of the Israelis.
I think so, and I think that the U.S. Congress is going to be aligned with that agreement. I don't think that the U.S. Congress is necessarily going to take a position that's not in line with the Israelis on this one, simply because for a while now, at least, the U.S. Congress has actually been more hostile to the Palestinian Authority, I think, than even the Netanyahu administration, much less Tzipi Livni and that and the center left crowd.
Yeah.
I'll
keep going with then more of the Baskin prereqs.
Well, I mean, so there are more things that he points out. Will both, if they're new Palestinian elections, will the winner take all, or are they going to share power? Will both sides respect the outcome of the elections? Will the Palestinian Authority release Hamas prisoners in the West Bank? Is Hamas going to release Fatah prisoners in Gaza? Will the U.S. and EU continue to provide financial support to the Palestinians? Will all of the 133 countries which have recognized the state of Palestine as an observer state recognize it with a joint government with Hamas? If they had done this when they went to the argument, they would have gotten fewer. They still would have gotten it. They would have gotten fewer.
Yeah.
Here's some other major concerns, and this is, I think, what the Israelis need to know, and I think they need to hear it from the Europeans publicly. I think they need to hear it from the U.S. publicly, and I don't think they're going to get it, which is if there's a joint PLO-Hamas agreement and Hamas abducts another Israeli soldier, will the PA stand behind it or reject it? If there's a joint PLO-Hamas agreement and rockets continue to be shot at Israel from Gaza, who's going to be held responsible? You cannot say that you have a joint government that is a Palestinian that is a Palestinian Authority government over Gaza and then say, no, Hamas did it. You can't attack the Palestinian Authority in Gaza.
Well, the third
That's not
factor
gonna
there, look, David, the people who are launching rockets are being repudiated, at least in name only, by Hamas. Hamas says, we're not doing it.
Well,
But somebody has to take responsibility for it.
That's the problem. So if
Yes.
it continues, you can't simply have this agreement be a way to shelter whoever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And it can't be that once the Palestinian Authority says that it's in control over Gaza, there's no longer any possibility of Israel going after Islamic Jihad, for example. It's going to happen, and that's a problem. With a new unity agreement, will Egypt reopen the Rafah border? Well, how is Egypt going to treat this new government in Gaza? My belief is it's not going to treat it any differently than it currently does. It already has a bad relationship with the Palestinian Authority, to be honest, much less with the Hamas government. The Palestinian Authority really blew it when Mubarak went out of power because they not only they defended Mubarak to begin with. Then they ended up coming over to the Morsi side. Then they actually reached out to Iran. And now you've got a nationalist in power in Egypt again who is seeing these people as not a good ally anymore. So not only do they hate the Muslim Brotherhood government in Gaza, but they don't trust the Palestinian Authority either. And so I'm not so sure how Egypt's going to deal with that. My bet is they're going to keep the border sealed, which is not going to be good for anybody. Will Hamas clergy regularly preach against Jews and Christians? Will this continue?
What do you think?
I think, of course, it will.
Of course it will.
Hamas says is never recognizing Israel. Does the PLO withdraw its recognition of Israel granted by President Arafat? Or does this mean that Hamas does recognize Israel? Or does it mean they're just going to ignore the question, which I'm thinking that the third is the alternative that's going to come up?
Yes.
That the Palestinian Authority will act as if it doesn't matter what Hamas believes, and it's simply going to move forward pretending that everything is wonderful and that there's no difference. I don't see.
So we don't have answers to any of these questions.
We don't have answers to any of these questions.
Although some of the questions have a likelihood of being no, that Hamas is not going to change.
Almost all of them.
Okay, so some of these questions are more relevant than others, obviously.
Hamas's covenant says that it's an Islamic resistance movement, that it's a wing of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine.
Yeah.
You've got Hamas's covenant says the day of just judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews. Initiatives and so-called peaceful solutions and international conferences are in contradiction to the principles of Hamas. Hamas, in the face of Jews' usurpation of Palestine, it's compulsory that the banner of jihad be raised. I mean, is Egypt going to treat the Palestinian Authority differently? How is Jordan going to react to this? I think the answer, to be honest, is that in the negative with all of them. I don't see how anybody sees this as a good thing in the short term. The long term is a different issue. Let's talk. I mean, in the short term, the questions are massive. They're profound. And they have long-ranging, broad implications in the relations between the Palestinians and every partner they've got, including Israel in the peace table.
So what's the best outcome? The best outcome would seem to be if the Palestinian Authority becomes essentially Fatah with a tag on of a docile Hamas. That's not going to happen.
Well, look, it could happen. I mean, I'm not going to say it's not going to happen because Hamas is fairly weakened in Gaza. It could happen. So let's say is there a good outcome here? Yes. Does the possibility of a good outcome here necessitate that Israel act as if nothing bad could possibly happen? The answer is no way. I mean, I think the only way to deal with this right now is to postpone, to suspend the peace talks for a period of time, at which then you'll move forward with an analysis of them. I can't see how the Palestinian Authority, amidst negotiating with Hamas, could possibly negotiate with Israel. And I can't see how Israel could possibly trust them at that point either. Trust is the basis of any negotiation. There wasn't much trust before this. There's clearly no trust now. And it doesn't make sense that you can simply say, here's what we think is going to happen, and therefore it's going to happen, and we're going to move forward. That's crazy.
Now, at least at this juncture, there seems to be like a 5-week period during which some of the the stances of Hamas will come clear. They're looking for a resolution on some areas of dispute between Hamas and Fatah. And somebody was saying essentially that we'll find out in 5 weeks if certain people are nominated for elective office. And can't that give us some information over the next 5 weeks?
Well, I mean, look, you can have information over the next few months in multiple different ways. I mean, first of all, you're going to have the run up to the elections. You're going to have the elections, but then you're going to have the implementation of whatever the reconciliation is, regardless of the elections. So you also have this issue of, is Hamas going to let the Palestinian Authority come in and take over Gaza? If the answer to that is no, it has significant implications on the peace process.
Well, that's why.
Is the Palestinian Authority going to flat out yield Gaza to Hamas? In which case, again, it has profound implications in the peace process.
And another aspect, of course, is who is the Palestinian negotiating team going to turn into? Do you want Hamasniks in the negotiating team?
Well, I think if you're going to include Gaza in a negotiation, you don't have much choice but to have Hamasniks in the team.
And so, what do you think their negotiating position might be?
Either that, or you're going to say, if there's an election that Hamas actually votes in, and it's clear that the Palestinian Authority is the representative of the people in Gaza, that's a different situation.
Yes.
But I think even then you'd have to see things being implemented over a period of time before you'd believe it. And I just can't see how it is expected of Israel to act as if nothing has happened here. I mean, it's almost like nothing to see here. Move along, as massive things are going on behind. I mean, this is not Leslie Nielsen here,
right?
But it seems that way. I mean, the people who are arguing that seem that way. They're so committed to the parties staying at the negotiating table that the parties themselves, I don't even understand how they could possibly think that they could stay at the negotiating table. Each side can't stay at the negotiating table. Maybe they can come back to the negotiating table. I mean, I tend to agree with Tzipi Livni. Tzipi Livni spoke in the press conferences about this today, and she's basically quoted as saying, "Look, as long as there's an Israel and there's a Palestinian,
we're going to negotiate.
Entity, we're going to negotiate.
We'll be at the table."
But she also said the negotiations can't go on now. They can't go on now.
Yeah. And what has the State Department reaction been so far?
No, they're not happy with the reconciliation because, like I said, at this point, there are automatic things that are supposed to happen because Hamas is a terrorist organization.
Right, and those are in compliance with what was put down for what was called a roadmap, and everybody understands what those are. And including acceptance of all previously negotiated protocols.
I mean, there are small scale violations of the peace agreements,
of course,
and then there are large scale violations of the peace. This is a giant scale violation of the peace agreement.
However, David, in the world we deal with, there's equivocation between the small scale and the large scale.
And not only is there equivocation, but there are people who just want to deny the reality that any of this matters. You can't. I constantly point out the fact that negotiations are based on the reality at the moment. They're never based on what used to be.
Well, which seems to be the bargaining point.
And not only is it the Palestinian bargaining point, there are a lot of people who say, well, how can Israel possibly offer less than they did in 2007? Or how can they offer less than they... Because the reality is the situation has changed. The situation is now vastly worse.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been talking about what happens if Hamas takes over. Now we got a reconciliation agreement where Hamas is going to be part of whatever you deal with.
Right.
So now you're dealing with a Hamas government in the West Bank controlling potentially a military that can launch weapons at the Israeli airport in Lod, right? I mean, the nightmare scenario of this could possibly happen, we now have officially has happened by agreement of the Palestinian Authority today. I mean, now you can argue that the implication of it will not be what the nightmare is.
That's
but
a different
that
issue,
has to be proven.
Yeah, in the long run.
It has to be proven. I mean, and I don't know how you'd go about doing that in the short run. I mean, this fundamentally alters the entire nature of the negotiating process. It would be like Israel saying, we're now going to not only make Kahane Chai a legal party,
yes,
but we're going to make them our negotiating partner.
Right, yeah.
I mean, really? Are the Palestinians going to negotiate with Kahane Chai? I mean, come on. I mean, and that's really what's going on here. Yeah, and not only that, you're going to say we're going to have Kahane Chai as part of the security apparatus. We're going to have overseeing the Palestinian Authority. Right? I mean, you know, the security co-op, every single aspect of the agreement as it exists now, of cooperation as it exists now, is now in jeopardy.
Mm-hmm.
Every single part of it. Economic cooperation, security cooperation, the visa process.
So why can't J.J. Goldberg see that?
I think people have wanted to argue that the Israel, I mean, the question of whether or not the Palestinians need to reconcile some of these issues, I think is secondary from the peace process. And my belief is, yes, the Palestinians do need to reconcile some of these issues. Yes, they will answer fundamental questions that are problematic in the peace process. But they also necessarily require a halt in the peace negotiations until some of them are answered. It's not an either or. It's not a you can't have.
What I'm asking, David, is why does J.J. Goldberg?
Because I think there's a pathology of hatred of Netanyahu.
Okay.
On the political left.
Yeah.
And the argument is that anything Netanyahu says is therefore wrong. There's a belief that Israel doesn't want the peace negotiations, and therefore any excuse is a valid excuse. Or is an invalid excuse, that there's no valid excuse. Well, in this case, I think there's a valid excuse. I think you'd have to be fairly blinded to not see a necessity to at least suspend negotiations until you get some answers here. I believe that in the long run, you're going to get figuring out how this plays out is going to significantly affect the peace process and may affect it positively.
Well,
but if you don't let it play out, you can't negotiate.
Let's look at what possibly has been happening in the West Bank, especially. There's been an increase of violence in the West Bank. There's been an increase of violence on the Temple Mount itself. How does this fit into
being fostered by Hamasniks?
Being fostered by Hamasniks to begin with. So that's a clue as to where they're going in the first place.
Yeah, and you also have the rise of Muslim Brotherhood supporters in Jordan who are threatening also, and the Kingdom of Jordan is having to put forth very critical positions of Israel that they really don't support in order to look like they support the people in the Palestinian citizens of Jordan. The situation right now is extremely volatile, and the answers to the vital questions are totally unknown.
Okay, let's give a plug quickly for Eric Traeger, who's coming on next Wednesday, the 1st of May. Eric Traeger, who works for the Washington Institute on Studies on the Middle East, is an expert on the Muslim Brotherhood. He'll be speaking May 1st at 7 o'clock in what used to be called the Bulldog Theater on the campus of Drake University, co-sponsored by Center for Global Citizenship and Jewish Federation. He certainly would be interesting to hear about his take on not only what's happening in Egypt, but its implications throughout the Middle East.
And, just talking about Egypt here, I mean, the Palestinians basically just made a decision that isolates them from both the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Jordanian government.
Right.
And the Israelis.
And the Saudis, too.
And the Saudis. So, and the U.S. Congress.
So they're
I mean,
not
think about
making
that
many
for a second.
friends.
Think about that for a second.
Yeah.
First of all, where's financial aid going to come from?
Where do you think it's going to come from?
Well, I think what's going to happen is that the U.S. government is going to try to maintain it. The Congress is going to veto it. The Congress may not even include it in the budget, in which case it doesn't matter what the president does. The president can't create money out of nowhere. He can send it or not send it, but
Okay.
it's not going to be there.
Iran. Iran
you-
has the perspective of supporting Hamas.
Iran might want to, but you're talking about a lot of money. I'm not sure that Iran in its current state is going to be able to help them. It may try, but that's another thing that's going to further isolate them. If they work with Iran, and this is the problem, if they work with Iran, they're going to completely isolate themselves from the Arab League. So this idea that peace with the Palestinians would then necessarily create peace with the rest of the Arab world would be completely false. In fact, at that point, you might even be hostile to the Arab world if you support the Palestinians who are working with their enemy. So the implications of what just happened need to be sorted out. I look at this and I say, for there to be a two-state solution, it's going to have to provide security and stability for Israel and for the neighbors of the Palestinian territories. Otherwise, it's not going to get forward. If you create a peace agreement that provides peace and stability for Israel and the Palestinians, but not for Egypt and not for Jordan and not for Syria, not for Lebanon,
Right.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
It's going to get vetoed. If you put forward an agreement that doesn't provide peace and security for Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, or Syria, you could completely forget it. Then you got no support.
And at current, the Palestinian Authority is saying the next negotiations have to focus on borders, not security.
And you've got a situation in which, as Gershon Baskin pointed out, right now the Palestinians are paying the West Bank, they're paying 60% of the budget of Gaza. They're paying for all their electricity and all their water. Well, if the Gaza government is about to financially collapse and the Palestinian government in the West Bank is not strong and needs foreign aid in order to support itself, much less to support itself and Gaza, this is
Right.
all going to fall apart.
Yeah.
I don't know what you do at that point. I mean, this is a situation in which the West does not want to continue to fund the Palestinians as a welfare state. They want to get the Arab nations to come in and take some of the load.
Yes.
But if the Arab nations are actively hostile to the governments there, they're not going to. There's no chance of that.
So this is brinksmanship.
Well, I think it's brokesmanship. I think they're past the brink. I think they've broken it, because the very fact that they would consider working with Hamas demonstrates to the Egyptians how hostile they are. I mean, there's no possible way the Egyptian government sees this as anything other than you're working to aid our enemy. Right? How can they? The Syrians are sitting there battling Sunni Muslim extremists, including large numbers of Palestinians. In Syria right now, the people who are getting killed in large numbers are actually Palestinians living in Syria. It's awful.
Yeah.
And the world doesn't care. And this situation is going to make it much worse, because now they really are a target. Because now the Palestinian government has officially allied itself with the Muslim Brotherhood-based Hamas, which is the official enemy of the Syrian government. I mean, this is a nightmare.
Because of the complexity of the parts.
Well, not only because of the complexity of the parts, but the implications of each one of the complexities. I mean, it's if you want to make the argument that Israel is going to get peace with its Arab neighbors based on negotiating peace with the Palestinians, right now it's simply not possible, much less definitely true. It's certainly not going to be a long-term solution. In fact, right now Israel could negotiate peace with the rest of the Arab countries a lot easier than it can negotiate anything with the Palestinians. In fact, that may help, Because at this point, Israel's common opponent would then be the Palestinian leadership. Unless Fatah proves conclusively that it's going to dismantle Hamas and take over the West Bank and enforce a secular nationalistic platform there, which would be supported by the Arab League, I don't see how anything even moves forward to that point. And that's going to take time. It's not, like I said, I mean, as negative as I am about what the implications may be, I'm also positive about what could happen. If given time, something good could come out of this. But the question is when?
Or the likelihood of it happening.
The likelihood of it happening is a different thing, but it's also a situation of how can you continue to press Israel at this point right now when you have no idea how this is going to play out. And I think the answer is you can't continue to press Israel.
We're hearing this coming through the main spokespersons for the PA, meaning Abbas and Erekat. Have we heard anything from people on the next cut down like Rajoub? Or not yet?
Well, I know we've heard, Hamas has certainly spoken out, and you got pictures of those guys, holding hands.
But that's establishment and establishment.
Yeah, I think that no one really knows what the implications are. I don't think any of them know either. The consequence, they've been fighting a civil war since 2007. A full-on civil war.
Yeah.
With hundreds of dead. Lots of property destroyed, lots of people arrested.
And people in jail. Right.
And, as much as people want to talk about animosity between Israel and the Palestinians right now, there's as much or more actual animosity between Fatah and Hamas.
Yeah, I remember the kneecapping.
And so, people being thrown off the top of buildings in Gaza City. I mean, let's be honest here. The Israelis never did anything like that. And so you're sitting here with a situation in which whatever amount of hatred you get, this religious hatred from the Palestinian side, particularly from the Hamas side, they have to deal with the hatred of each other going forward. And no matter what Abbas and Ismail Haniyeh say, the people further down the line are going to not trust the other side.
Yeah.
You're going to have constant wondering whether or not the Palestinian Authority is going to arrest Hamas officials, accuse them of working with Iran, accuse them. The Egyptian dismantling of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt did a tremendous amount of harm to Hamas. Hamas may well be in worse financial shape even than we know because Egypt closed so many of the smuggling tunnels, and that's where Hamas's primary income came from. Yeah. So they may well be in a position where they cannot continue to run Gaza, and this may be a way for them to find an honorable way out. But even if you're going to include all of those things as, yes, this is wonderful, you still have to see the impact on the ground. Because that could all change tomorrow as soon as there's cash flow. As soon as they have money, they could say, well, we don't need you anymore. Now we're going to take over the new apparatus and we'll have another decade to fight. It's the issue is whether or not negotiations can go on now. And particularly whether or not Israel and the Palestinians should be pressured to remain at the negotiating table right now. And I think it's fairly clear that the answer to that question is no. The answer to those questions is no. And it's not possible.
I think we still have to watch how American foreign policy looks at this particular issue, because it's not a given.
I think you're. I mean, so let's deal with my assumption that Hamas is extraordinarily weak and about to collapse. They would not want that to come out.
No,
the U.S. government wouldn't want it to come out because they could cause a catastrophe in the Palestinian territories.
Yes.
The Israelis wouldn't want it to come out, and neither would the Palestinians. So let's look at that situation as a potential situation here. If that's really going on, the impact of it would be massive. It would be good and certainly in the long run, But in the short run, there are a lot of things that have to happen before you can actually proceed knowing what the resolution is going to be. Because if the resolution is Fatah comes in, Hamas doesn't really like what Fatah is doing, what the Palestinian Authority is doing, and then they reach out to Iran and say, we need help, we're willing to let Islamic Jihad fund us instead of the Fatah, then you end up with a nightmare scenario that's bad for both Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and that could happen within the next few months.
And the United States.
Yeah, but that could happen in the next few months.
Right.
So, acting as if, this is only good if Hamas is going bankrupt and can't run Gaza anymore is not realistic. There are consequences here that could be far-reaching and very bad, and certainly overwhelm the issues around the peace table. I mean, you can forget the issue of where the border goes through somebody's backyard or field when you're dealing with, will an entire 1.5 million people of the population agree to the peace agreement, or are they going to be actively hostile and at war with us? I mean, that's what you're dealing with, at war.
Mm-hmm.
So it's difficult. It's difficult to deal with. We'll find out in the next little bit here what happens. But I think the blame from the Palestinian side is going to be on Israel from withdrawing from the negotiations. I think Israel's perfectly happy to say, of course, at this point. I don't think I don't think at this point there's any need on the Israeli side to say, no, we're not, or it's your fault, or, they're going to say, look, we just can't possibly negotiate with this at this point. I think that the European Union is going to continue to pretend that nothing is happening, move along, and they're going to continue to demonstrate just how irrelevant they are for doing that. Because if they can't contribute to the real issues on the ground, they're not helpful. And in the meantime, the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict is obviously secondary to what's going on in Eastern Europe, on the Russian border.
Which is ambiguous, or at least ambiguously interpreted by lots of other people.
Well, and you're also running into a situation in which the Israelis could potentially work with the Russians and say, we're not going to interfere in Syria. We're not going to, we're not going to take sides against you in this stuff.
If you don't take sides
with or if you don't take sides in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict too. Because Russia could potentially step in and aid this leadership too, but they're not going to, because remember, Russia's main enemy in Syria, Russia's main reason for supporting the Syrian government, think about this too, is guess what? Their Muslim Brotherhood. So you not only have all those other countries, including the U.S. Congress, opposed, but you also have the Russian government opposed. I mean, there's a lot of incredulity going on, I think, around the diplomatic core of the world at this point, because the Palestinians have single-handedly isolated themselves from the U.S. Congress, from Russia, from Syria, from Egypt, from Jordan, from Lebanon, and from the Israelis.
It's good to have friends.
Who are they? I mean,
They're going it by themselves.
I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah.
They're even isolated from Iran at the moment because Iran is backing the Syrian position.
Yeah.
They don't even have the backing of Iran. Who is backing them? Saudis aren't backing them because they're nationalists. Qataris aren't backing them. And the Qataris are trying to argue with Hamas that their position isn't good. The Qataris used to be in that vein. They're not even there anymore. There's literally nobody supporting them. They're on their own.
Would you say,
how do you deal with that?
Is this a sui generis situation? In other words, is prior analyses of failing to take account to the unique nature of the current situation?
I think this is literally the worst negotiating position I can imagine the Palestinians even being in. I mean, if you can't even get the Russians to support your position against the United States position, you're in trouble. The United States and Russia are in agreement along with Egypt and Syria and Iran. I mean, think about that. The U.S., Russia, and Syria and Iran and Egypt are all in opposition to them on this issue.
Right.
You might not even have UN support for this because so many of the countries are allied with those groups.
It doesn't stop Abbas from going in this direction, apparently.
What a mess.
What a mess.
I mean, that's a bad negotiating position. We're going to see what happens going forward, but the profound implications of this are fairly obvious. You can't simply act as if nothing has happened. And so I think those who continue want to make that point and say the Israelis have to negotiate and they have to stay at the negotiating table, it's ridiculous. I don't even think it's a reasonable argument. Now, could they come back at some point? And I mean, they're going to have to, because they're going to have to negotiate now about what the nature of their security cooperation is, the existing security cooperation. They're going to have to negotiate about existing border access, existing access to Jerusalem, water rights, energy rights, taxation, all those things. I mean, they're going to have to renegotiate months and months and months worth of things. So it may be that negotiations go on past April 29th simply to renegotiate existing issues. And, you know, it's going to be a very interesting thing. But in the meantime, we're going to head into next week where we have all kinds of issues dealing with the Holocaust, Holocaust-related events. And we hope you have a wonderful weekend. This has been Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman and Mark Finkelstein.